In the unfolding chronicle of Ghana's democratic evolution, few governmental actions have wounded the collective spirit of the nation as profoundly as the ruthless implementation of the so-called haircut on pensioners by the NPP administration. This was not merely a fiscal maneuver, it was a silent execution, a policy that snatched away the last threads of dignity from those who had already given their lives in service to the Republic. It stands as a grim betrayal of the very principles Ghana holds sacred: Ubuntu, reverence for the elderly, and the enduring bond of communal care and solidarity. What was promised as economic reform became instead a merciless turning of the knife against the very backbone of the nation's history. This was not a mere economic adjustment. It was the worst kind of betrayal, a calculated, cold-blooded stripping of the dignity and humanity of the very people who built Ghana brick by brick, chalkboard by chalkboard, stethoscope by stethoscope. Imagine a man who worked 35 years as a public school teacher in the Upper West region. Rain or shine, dusty Harmattan winds or torrential rains, he stood before chalkboards without markers, without desks, and often with no textbooks, teaching under mango trees. His reward after retirement? A modest pension, barely enough to buy hypertension medicine and bags of rice for the month. Yet even this pittance wasn't spared. The government reached into his pocket and took a slice of the little he had left. That was the so-called haircut. Ghana's pensioners are not just statistics on a national registry. They are the foundation on which the country stands. The old nurse who stitched wounds during the revolution with candlelight in village clinics, the railway worker who labored through dangerous tunnels, the civil servant who typed hundreds of memos with outdated typewriters, they all gave their lives to Ghana. And what was their reward? Under the NPP government's domestic debt exchange program, they were told that the nation was in financial crisis and everyone must sacrifice. But why were the sacrifices always demanded from the poor? Why were the most vulnerable always the first to be targeted? While pensioners were getting letters that their coupons would be slashed, ministers were driving brand new Toyota Land Cruisers and flying first class to international conferences. Their children were schooling abroad. Their wives were shopping in Dubai. But back home, the very people who raised Ghana from the ashes of colonialism were dying quietly in their homes because they could no longer afford insulin, dialysis, or heart medications. The worst part of this tragic episode wasn't just the money that was stolen from the pensioners, it was the lies. President Nana Addo, standing before cameras, told Ghanaians confidently that there would be no haircut. Those words echoed across radio stations, reassured families, and calmed the elderly. But behind closed doors, the policies were already being implemented. It was a lie that cost lives. Pensioners went to their banks only to be told they could no longer access their full funds. Others were forced to sign onto new bonds that stretched maturity dates so far into the future that they'd need to live to 110 to benefit. Imagine being 78 years old and being told your bond would mature in 2039. Perhaps the most infuriating contradiction in this saga is the hypocrisy. While pensioners were literally dying from preventable diseases, the political elite thrived. The same government that said it had no money to pay full pensions was simultaneously approving budgets for new government mansions, imported vehicles, and senseless conferences. It was common to see videos of politicians popping champagne at birthday parties and weddings that resembled royal coronations. Luxury was the new normal in political circles. And yet, when pensioners cried out, asking for a few hundred cedis more to buy medicine, they were told, "We are all in this hardship together." What hardship? Was it the same hardship that forced pensioners to walk several kilometers to the district capital to check their pension status? Was it the same hardship that saw elderly people choosing between food and medication? While the politicians feasted, the pensioners starved. While the ministers got VIP medical care abroad, The pensioners died waiting in overcrowded hospitals with no beds. And die they did. Hundreds of elderly Ghanaians passed away during and after the haircut saga, not just from illness, but from neglect, from broken hearts, from hopelessness. The human cost of the NPP's reckless economic policies cannot be overstated. Behind every haircut was a story, a grandmother who could no longer afford diabetes injections, a retired soldier who couldn't afford his heart medication, a widow whose pension was her only link to survival. Their deaths were not just unfortunate, they were preventable, and therefore criminal. This was not policy. This was cruelty dressed in the robes of governance. Adding insult to injury, even those who were able to access some of their pension funds faced limitations. Long queues formed in banking halls, filled with elderly men and women clutching documents and prayer beads, hoping they could withdraw what was rightfully theirs. But restrictions were placed. Some were told they could only withdraw a fraction of their savings. Others were subjected to complicated bureaucratic processes meant to frustrate and discourage. What kind of country treats its elderly like beggars? The government claimed it was broke, that the country needed more revenue. So they taxed everything in sight, except their own opulence. The taxes they imposed were numerous and punishing. 1. E-levy, taxing basic mobile money transfers, punishing the poor for sending money to their families. 2. COVID-19 levy, still being charged even after the pandemic had ended, with no clear explanation of where the funds went. 3. Sanitation levy. Yet, cities remained dirty, and waste management worsened. 4. Betting tax, targeting the youth trying to make ends meet in a collapsed job market. 5. Emissions tax, taxing car owners while public transportation remained dysfunctional. These taxes choked the average Ghanaian, and despite all this revenue, the healthcare system remained broken. Hospitals were overcrowded, ambulances were scarce, essential drugs ran out regularly. Even children were not spared the neglect. In rural areas across the country, school children still sat on cement blocks under trees, their classrooms blown away by storms long ago, never replaced. What happened to all the borrowed billions? What happened to all the levies? Why were pensioners being asked to sacrifice when the government couldn't even provide chalk, let alone roofs for schools? The story of Ghana's pension haircut is more than a fiscal policy. It is a human tragedy. It is the story of a government that forgot its soul, that looked at the wrinkled hands of its elders and saw not wisdom, but expendability. The NPP government will be remembered, not just for economic mismanagement, but for the blood on its hands, for every pensioner who died in agony, for every child who watched their grandfather fade away because the medicine was too expensive, for every teacher who retired into poverty, for every nurse who gave her best years to the nation only to be discarded like trash. History will not be kind, and it shouldn't be, because governance is not just about building roads or making speeches, it is about protecting the most vulnerable. And in that, this government failed. This story must be told, retold, and documented for generations, not to stir anger, but to awaken the conscience of a nation. Let the story of the pensioners be a warning. Let it be a rallying cry. Never again should any government, NPP or otherwise, treat our elders this way. Because a country that does not honor its elders, that sacrifices them for politics, is not just poor, it is doomed. If you believe the truth must be told without fear or favor, then this is your home. Subscribe to Ghana AI News, your #1 source for unfiltered news, fearless investigations, and the voice of the voiceless. We don't just report, we expose. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stand with the truth.